want to make sure. Okay, it's charged.
Like here somewhere.
Are you a loudspeaker?
Somehow, every project. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Mama is coming. You know, this is the guy.
Oh,
Technically, yeah, you
I
know him.
haven't seen you in so long. Good to see you. I'm fine, thanks. I was like, I know him. It's been a long time. So. I'm fine. How are you?
So are you going to stop?
Yeah. I'm waiting for just 5 minutes and then fellows
We're
will
on
come.
Harvard time, aren't we? Harvard time is usually 7 minutes out.
Oh, 7
That's
minutes.
when the
Yeah.
classes start, so
Oh, I see.
maybe we could wait a little.
Yeah, some fellows will come.
When I first got hired at Harvard, it was maybe, actually it was before, maybe 12 years ago. They took my picture in front of that painting of Helen Keller.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's very interesting.
I always think of that. I think I was so much younger then. But I was just here, I was just teaching. I didn't do any of this other work. I just came here to teach. And I remember thinking that was such an interesting spot. They put me there.
Which you do like most time, teaching or doing this other activity?
I like the combination.
The combination, yeah.
I really do. It's more fulfilling.
Good.
How many fellows at Hutchin?
17? 17, I think. Yeah, in the spring, yeah, 17.
Is
Yeah.
it a public event?
This is a public event, yeah.
People will come.
Yeah, most of the time fellows actually. Yes, sometimes, yeah, some people with interest may come. Everybody coming. Oh, I don't think so. There are no many Ethiopians who got this interest in.
And you didn't advertise.
Yeah, of course, of course.
I remember when Bacon gave his, I think you know Bacon, he
Yeah.
tells everybody.
Oh, okay, I see.
And people came, when they.
Oh, I see.
And not so many, it was kind of crowded.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't advertise. I just. Yeah, it's academic, so I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Do you mind if I talk a little bit about
No problem. No problem. Yeah, he was in prison with me. You know that.
Yeah, I know that.
So yeah, no problem. Yeah, he's a German. Yeah. Yeah. Quite interesting. I mean, the time there are many political prisoners got released in the past few months. So I think not changing in a way that we want, but the government is forced at least
Yeah.
to release. Yeah, some of them got incarcerated for 8 years, 10 years even, for just being journalists, being political activists. So yeah, it's a relief for families and them at least. It's very terrible. I mean, Ethiopian prisons are so. I mean, it's a terrible place to be there. Yeah, 150, 200 people in one room. I can imagine. I mean, it's so congested and so that. I see. Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's very low ceiling and it's. I mean, there is no water. It's very hot. It's so tough. Yeah, we work especially on the daytime. We went to the library. There are small prison libraries. Most of the time, most of the books are just donated by the American embassy there in Ethiopia. It's just a book for 11th grader here in America and 10th grader. I mean, for the mass of the prisoners, I mean, those books are important. But for us, yeah, any book actually, you are right, any book. We try to smuggle some books. There are ways, the good thing. I mean, yeah. Not visitors, police officers actually. Yeah, our families will pay them. So Like, if they brought us 2, 3 books, yeah, then we give them 200, 300 Ethiopian dollars. So, yeah, I mean, corruption is somehow good.
That's good
It's
corruption.
good corruption,
That's
benevolent.
the thing about corruption, isn't it? It's sort of pervasive, and there are different facets.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, we were talking that, I mean, okay, we are committing corruption. No, I mean, there is this unjust law that's ban us from reading books, so we need to read. What I mean, yeah, of course, yes, unjust law. Yeah, so
Do you have friends and colleagues that you know who recently released?
yes. Actually, our case was totally withdrawn yesterday.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, so yeah, 4 of our friends were still in court. So yesterday, yeah, we got this letter from the prosecutor, and they told us, okay, it's totally withdrawn. It was after 4 years, you can imagine.
How do you feel about that? How does that make you feel that it's totally withdrawn?
It's good, I mean, but still they have all the right to revive at any time. They used to do that before, so it's a relief, but well, still you feel threatened. I mean, they have all the right to do whatever they want. But I mean, we think that we got released, but there are many still suffering. So I mean, our case is not that much important. Though.
Some time has passed.
Yeah. We got tired. I mean, it has been 4 years. Just about 70 trials so far. So we went to court for 70 times, and it's so boring. I mean, every time we go there, and just it is. Yeah.
I mean, I can't
It's
even.
it's so amazing. I mean, yeah, it's so frustrating. From the police to the prosecutor to the judge, even to the prison administrators. Everywhere you go, there are this bureaucracy. They think that we are prisoners of war. I mean, because they think that we are politically affiliated with some groups, or we are not.
They have to be.
Yes. So yeah, it's so threatening. I mean, every time even after we get released, there are people who followed us. I mean, there are people, especially from the intelligence, that they will tell, okay, you are meeting these guys, we know that, they will call you in this and that, every harassment and treatment. But yeah, once it passed, it's good. It's a good experience. I mean, it's
How
just
do you go from that to being someplace like Virginia or New York? How do you go from that?
yeah, it's amazing. I was released 10 days before Obama's 2015 visit to Ethiopia. I mean, they just released as a welcoming gift, yeah, because there was this international push from the U.S. government that well, international institution. So we got released. 5 of us got released. I mean, abruptly. I was reading in a library. I was reading Malcolm X's new biography, and I hear my name and just get out. And I asked, okay, how? And they said, your charge is withdrawn. That's how I got released. But after I got released, I was to go to Paris to receive an award in our group named, but they confiscated my passport up on the airport. So for the next 8 months, for the next 8 months, they just confiscated my passport. I was even filing a case in a court, but they said, we don't want to give you. There is no law. I mean, they have no right to confiscate my passport, and we don't care about the laws. What we care is about what we think. They just bluntly told me that. So for 8 months, they just confiscated my passport. Then in the meantime, I was applying for this Young African Leadership Initiative program, YALI. So actually, fortunately, I got selected as one of the fellows. And on the deadline, the deadline was June 2016. They called me, the intelligence officers called me, and please get your passport. And I was surprised. I mean, the U.S. Embassy was pushing them, to get me. So, that's how I came to Virginia as a fellow, Obama fellow. Then I went back. Again, they confiscated my passport upon my arrival. And I was surprised when they do that. After 6 weeks, I went back. And again, they confiscated for 5-6 weeks. Then I came back to New York, NYU, for another fellowship. So again, they confiscated my passport even when I came in. 2-3 days after, they just gave me. then finally I came. And yeah, I transferred to Harvard.
Transfer was much easier.
Yeah, of course, it's just, so every time I went to airports, I have this trauma still.
Yeah, you have so much
I mean,
anxiety.
yeah. Not problem, anyways. Thank you, Jane, for coming and for everything you're doing now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's colloquium. Professor Gates is unable to attend, but we'll manage, won't we? Next week's colloquium will be delivered by LaFleur Stevens-Dugan, and she will speak on the race for votes, how candidates use negative racial appeals about blacks to win white votes. Now please welcome to the podium the fabulous Jane Unruh. She's the director of the program, the Scholars at Risk program here at Harvard.
Hello, I am Jane Unruh, and I direct the Scholars at Risk program at Harvard. Our program provides 10-month academic fellowships to at-risk and persecuted scholars, artists, and writers from around the world. We're very pleased to work in close partnership with the Hutchins Center, and on behalf of Harvard SAR, I would like to thank Professor Gates, Abby, Krishna, and everyone at Hutchins for their support. I'm honored to be here today to introduce Zelalem Kibret. Zelalem, as you know, is a fellow at the Hutchins Center, and he is also a Scholars at Risk fellow at Harvard. Zelalem's current research focuses on transitional politics and justice, post-conflict Africa, traditional justice, accountability in relation to peace building, counterterrorism, liberation technology, and the role of the individual person in international law. By training, Zelalem, who earned his LLM from Addis Ababa University in public international law, is a lawyer specialized on public international law and was a professor of law at Ambo University in Ethiopia until April 2014. Zelalem is also widely known as a blogger at the Zone 9 blogging platform, a collective which blogs and campaigns on human rights, constitutionalism, and democracy in Ethiopia. As a result of his involvement in the Zone 9 blogging platform, which he also co-founded, Zelalem was threatened by the Ethiopian government and subjected to harassment and intimidation. In 2014, when it was reported that the blog was going to resume publishing after several months of inactivity, Zelalem was arrested along with other journalists and accused of attempting to incite violence, of collaborating with terrorist groups to overthrow the government. Following Zelalem's arrest, he was eventually dismissed from his university position, with the university citing his absence from the university and his failure to respond to their notices as justification for dismissal. After more than a year, during which Zelalem was subjected to torture, he and several others were released from custody and charges against them were reportedly dropped. It's interesting to note that Zelalem was in the prison library reading a biography of Malcolm X when he learned that he was being released. Though out of prison, Zelalem and others experienced surveillance, and Zelalem could not continue his work and live in safety in the country, and he reached out to the Scholars at Risk network. Along with his colleagues, Zelalem is a recipient of the 2015 Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award and the 2015 Reporters Sans Frontières Citizen Journalist Award. In 2016, Zelalem was selected as one of the Mandela Washington Fellows, a flagship program of President Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative, YALI, and spent 6 weeks at the University of Virginia, the College of William and Mary, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, James Monroe's Highland, and at James Madison's Montpelier, under the Civic Leadership track. That summer, the National Scholars at Risk Network, of which our program is a member, secured a position for Zelalem at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the NYU School of Law. We are delighted that Zelalem has joined us this year at Harvard and that he has been able to pursue current works exploring challenges to social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa. and opportunities made possible by promising new technologies. Please welcome Zelalem Kibret.
Okay, thank you, Jen, for this generous introduction. As well, I want to thank the Hutchins Center, Krishna, Abi, Skip, if he's not, even if he's not around. I want to thank my wife as well and friends for being supportive in my journey to this prestigious place, Harvard. So I'm glad that I'm here today to talk about liberation technology, new social movements and change in the Sub-Saharan Africa. So I will continue presenting my research that I was working for the past several months. I will start with a personal story from 2012. Here we go. On August 20, 2012 noon, I was working from my office to home with a friend of mine. Not long we walked before a stranger was approaching me and showed me to a compound that belongs to the Ethiopian ruling party. Another guy joins him and dragged me to a small and confined room. Immediately after I was seated in that little confining place, the two individuals that I have never seen them before asked me where I think I am in. I retorted promptly that I believe I am in a place that belongs to the Ethiopian ruling party. One of the guys abruptly dismissed my guess and told me with a smirk that I am at a place that belongs to the National Intelligence and Security Service, the notorious Ethiopian Intelligence Bureau. That means the two guys are officers of the bureau. In this belief, I asked them why I am shoved into this place then. That was the first moment I got a punch straight in my face. Disbelief hits me again. What's going on? I was asking myself while trying to put myself together. Unfortunately, there was no time to answer the question I raised. Immediately after the first punch, I was floored and forelegs were all over me. For the next 3 to 4 hours, I passed through an ordeal that I can't ever imagine. I was beaten everywhere. Every limb in my body was pain. Because of the severe kneecapping, I was not able to walk or stand by myself for the next 5 days. Bruises everywhere. My hands, thighs, and my back were all discolored. So why I was kidnapped? So why I was subjected to torture? As I understood immediately from the questions that I was asked by the officers, it was all about my online activities. It starts like this. On March 2011, just a few weeks after the ouster of long-serving leaders in North Africa, which was resulted after a persistently determined popular protest, with the motive of mirroring stories about popular protests in Ethiopia, I launched my own personal blog. Nonetheless, for the fear of repercussion, by reserving my political activities over personalized social media platforms, I keep the blog apolitical as possible by making it a platform of sharing books, mostly pirated books. Even though I tried to be apolitical, a year after I launched my blog, on May 23, 2012 morning, I just learned that my blog was made inaccessible in Ethiopia. It was blocked because the sole telecom provider in the nation, Ethio Telecom, found it political. Although it was preposterous, honestly, I was stunned by the measure. 3 months after my blog has been suspended, I ended up in the hands of those two security officers. They were asking me about my social media activities and my contacts. I was asked why I prefer to write on the internet instead of writing for the newspapers. There must be something that I'm trying to hide from the authorities. That was their guess. They even showed me a poorly made forged document that shows a political conspiracy as if it appeared on my blog. The whole saga culminated with a warning and threats. I was ordered to stop what I am doing on the internet. If not, I was told that I could be easily eliminated. I left the place dragging my legs and gravely traumatized. Immediately after, regrettably, I deleted many of my social media accounts and tried to stay in the low key. The incident helped me to reflect on the role of the internet in challenging entrenched authoritarianism and the risk that naturally follows. That's why a lawyer is stand here on the podium to talk about the nexus of modern communication tools and social movements in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Across the African continent, especially in the Sub-Saharan subcontinent, long simmering citizen grievances are venting against regimes that appear to be ineffective and towards laws and policies designed to malign genuine and democratic quests. Interpreting these countless quests in a subcontinent that embodied more than 50 independent and mostly volatile states and a home for 1.1 billion people is not only daunting, but it's impossible. However, studying the observable trends that are ultimately shaping the subcontinent is a daunting but possible imperative. Social movements of various kinds are among the notable instances of observable trends that are currently boiling in the sub-Saharan part of Africa, from the Haratians anti-modern slavery movement in Mauritania to the This Flag democratic movement in Zimbabwe to the movement for peace in the youngest and conflict-ridden nation in the world, South Sudan. Young people in all parts of the subcontinent are pursuing freedom, justice, and peace. Communication technologies, as fondly dubbed as liberation technologies, are playing an indispensable role in the assistance of these dreamers who are pursuing a better share in their respective communities. Before we go detailing the depths and width of new social movements in sub-Saharan Africa, saying a few words on the theoretical and practical outlining of these new technologies would clarify misconceptions. So what's liberation technology and how widespread they are in sub-Saharan Africa to impact these societal changes will be what we will see next. In his 2010 eminent work titled Liberation Technology, Stanford's political sociologist Larry Diamond amplified the term liberation technology. He has defined it in its broadest sense. Dr. Diamond said, quote, liberation technology is any form of information and communication technology, or ICT, that can expand political, social, and economic freedom, end quote. He further said, again quote, in the contemporary era, it means essentially the modern interrelated forms of digital ICT, the computer, the internet, the mobile phone, and countless innovative applications for them, including new social media, end quote. Since his widely written assertion, especially after the popular revolutions in the Middle East that ignited late in 2010, scholars and activists alike echoing the phrase liberation technology in every platform. Cognizant of the fast-changing pace of communication tools in the past decade, some tried to redefine it so that there won't be misunderstanding and misuse of these technologies. So what's liberating about the so-called liberation technologies? It's true that technology is a mere tool in human daily endeavor to conquer the savagery of nature. New technologies help individuals and society to make ideas better work. In other words, technology is worthy as long as there is an idea that necessitates it. It could be a virtuous cause or a vicious dream. Liberation technologies are basically human methods that help humans better communicate to each other and better interpret facts. The power of these technologies relied on their model. They are designed to interconnect people and ideas. They are powerful because they are purposed to network as many individuals as possible. The liberating factor of these technologies lies here in their networking capacity. Liberating technologies can pump out layers of individual grievances against a certain curtailing factor. It could be against a repressive state or a restrictive policy or law. Or it could be against an intrinsic social element. Or it could be against anything that affects networked individuals in any way that matters. In the past several years, hundreds of millions of people in the sub-Saharan part of Africa are able to access one or several types of these new communication technologies, as we call them liberation technologies. Although internet penetration in the region is yet under 20%, however, the pace of the growth of netizens is astounding. According to the International Telecom Union, ITU, in the year 2016 alone, the number of internet users in Africa increased by 50%. Last year, in 2017, there was a 20% increase in the number of network users in Africa. As of the beginning of 2018, considering that an average mobile users have 2 SIM cards, there are around 1 billion mobile subscribers in Africa. To the shock of many, as per the June 2017 global report by Akami Technologies, the world's largest cloud delivery platform on internet speed, on average, a Nairobian living in the slum of Kibret has a faster internet connection than a New Yorker living in Brooklyn, or an Australian for that matter, or a Swedish for that matter again. This Kenya outranked Australia on the internet speed story was a much hyper topic in the Australian press by the time. Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull dismissed it as a complete rubbish, mentioning low internet penetration in Kenya. It's somehow tricky, but it's true. Such a dramatic growth of connectivity is a feast for cyber optimists and a dismay for techno pessimists. Generally speaking, in spite of wide-ranging shackles, the sub-Saharan part of Africa is leapfrogging in its quest for digital connectivity. However, that's only true if we tend to see the glass half full. There is a flip side on this story that I will try to talk later in the talk. Before I proceed to the question of what liberation technology got to do with social movements, I will try to shed some light on the newness of social movements in sub-Saharan Africa. Many scholars and activists are cautious in studying social movements in Africa. That's basically reasoned by the fact that the theoretical underpinning of social movements are Eurocentric in the past and Americocentric up recently. Disregard of practical cases of social movements in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world highly hampered the theoretical acceptability of studies of social movements in those parts of the world. One of the earliest works on social movements in Africa was the 1995 African Studies in Social Movements and Democracy, edited by two of the continent's eminent public scholars, or public intellectuals as we call them. Mohamed Mamdani and Ernest Wamba pointed out this challenge of studying social movements in Africa under the shadow of purely Western social theories. In the volume, authors of various kinds has tried to show how social movements in Africa are ill-suited in Western conceptualization of popular movements in general. Unfortunately, let alone new social movements, even the old-fashioned social movements in Africa are not well studied. Since the Mamdani Wamba pioneer work, there are only few works that get published in that regard. When we bounce to the newness of the social movements, the adjective new was started to attach on social movements in the 1970s. In a motive to distinguish new types of social movements, which are wide in their quest and complex in their applications, with all kinds of social movements rooted under the communist utopian dream of decimating the binary of upper and lower class of society by seeking economic equality. In other words, which emphasize on economic aspect of their quest, contemporary social movements in the subcontinent are essentially cultural and political. New communication tools played a pivotal role in redefining these quests. The second major factor that made new social movements new is the strategies and the tools employed by the leaders of the movements that further horizontalize individual relations within the movement. Liberation technology helped elements of the new movements to build trust and horizontal mutuality with ease and fast. The third and yet still a very significant factor that caused newness to social movements in sub-Saharan Africa is the space they are happening in. Unlike the traditional types of social movements in contemporary Africa are not necessarily expected to take the streets. Although offline works are essential to take movements up to their destination, however, in many of the cases, social movements that reside in cyberspace are also impactful. To paraphrase it, new social movements are taking the public sphere to the cyber world. Liberation technologies are at the heart of this endeavor of digitization of the movement. How this observable newness of social movements are practically affecting popular movements in the continent is the underlying query that I try to answer in researching social movements in the subcontinent. Protests and movements in the sub-Saharan Africa, for that matter, including North Africa. The last couple of years, we can at least able to observe triplets of these movements. Identity and new social movements, which are essentially seeking recognition of their distinct identity, are the first kinds of movements that are stretched in all parts of the subcontinent. Reclaiming an altered or ignored identity is the very foundation of these movements. Although such kinds of movements are virtually simmering in every sovereign state of the subcontinent, the case of Anglophone Cameroon, the Oromo protest in Egypt, the Haratines movement in Mauritania are good instances that show the visible trend in that regard. The root cause of the turmoil in Anglophone Cameroon and the movement that followed, as many of the subcontinent's problem, goes back to colonialism. The northwestern and southwestern part of the present-day Cameroon are English-speaking regions resulting from British colonialism. By contrast, the rest of Cameroon is French-speaking, which again resulted from French colonialism. Since after 1961, UN-mediated union of the two linguistically divided Cameroons, Anglophone Cameroon, which consists about 1/5 of the total population of Cameroon, expressed its grievances in many ways up until it spiraled to be a full-blown social movement. Aimed at linguistic justice, Cameroonians in the northwest and southwestern part of the nation are using new communication tools like the internet and social media to amplify their causes. If it was not for these new tools, the popular movement would have a fate of its likes in the past, easily crushed by the region. Unlike the case of Anglophone Cameroon, the Oromo movement in Ethiopia has no colonial roots in its strictest sense. However, history of subjugation of the Oromos by different Ethiopian emperors since the last quarter of the 19th century contributes to the current grievance that can be summed as a quest for cultural justice. Although the Oromos are the largest ethnic groups in Ethiopia as well as in East Africa, however, they are, as it is framed by the ongoing popular movement, marginalized and assimilated to the culture that they are alien to. Like its Anglophone Cameroon counterpart, the Oromo social movement refined its quest for the digital age. By using cyber weapons, it is currently able to twist the strong arm of the state to its own terms. The leaderless, horizontal, and highly liberation technology dependent social movement is yet another practical proof of how a liberation technology adept movement can gate through the traditional barriers of monopolized public sphere and media. The third case in this nexus of identitarian new social movements with the modern communication technology in the subcontinent is the anti-slavery and racial justice Haratine and Negro Mauritanist movement in Mauritania. Out of the three major ethnic groups currently living in Mauritania, the Haratines or the Black Moors constituted more than 40% of the total population. However, because they are descendants of former slaves, the Haratines are the underdogs living in the lower stratum of the Mauritanian society. To the worst, some of them are still under formal enslavement. Although there are recent positive legal measures taken by the Mauritanian government, however, practically life as the Black Moor in Mauritania is tough in contrast with the top dogs, or the Bedouins, or the white Moors. By virtue of the Mauritanian state's draconian measures against those who speak about the plight of Haratines, liberation technologies appear to be the only outlets to speak and campaign about the cause. Many Haratines joined the movement using numerous new communication tools, including social medias, impressing for change, and all against continuing stigmatization. As we can infer from these three identitarian movements in Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Mauritania, liberation technologies of a different kind are utilized at the very means of networking lone voices to rise for linguistic, cultural, and racial justice, respectively. The second package of social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa is what I call movements for constitutionalism, especially those movements against constitutional coups or the scrap of constitutional tenure limit by leaders all over the subcontinent. If there is one thing that tickles every African social media user to laughter, it must be a joke purportedly said by the outgoing Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe. Most of these jokes are presented as quick, witty retorts. One of the jokes from 2013 goes as follows. An unnamed British journalist asked President Mugabe, "Mr. President, when are you bidding the people of Zimbabwe farewell?" Mr. President Mugabe quickly answers, "Where are they going?" The journalist asked another question. "Sir, don't you think 89 years would be a great time to retire as the president?" President Mugabe fires back, "Have you ever asked the Queen this question, or is this just for African leaders?" Funny, but jokes aside, leaders' refusal to leave tenure upon term expiration is one of the very problems many sub-Saharan African countries are facing recently. The problem is pervasive, especially among nations in central part of Africa. Long-serving leaders from Rwanda to Gabon to the Republic of Congo are extending their tenure by holding a sham referendum and amending constitutions of their respective countries. According to the African Center for Strategic Studies, since the dawn of the new millennium, at least 10 African presidents have successfully altered the constitutional provisions that limits their term in power and becomes life presidents, like the Queen of England. This highly hampered a democratic process in those respective nations. However, this is one side of the story. In many of these countries, the process of elimination of the term limit was not unmet with resistance. It was subject of fierce online and offline continuing resistances. Actually, in spite of unfortunate instances that leaders outpowered movements for the time being and stayed in power, new media-adept citizens were able to thwart attempts of elimination of term limits and the refusal of stepping down by many other leaders in the subcontinent. In 2011, a replica of the Arab Spring and cyber-initiated Enough is Enough social movement in Senegal effectively prevent the then President Abdoulaye Wade from scrapping the two-term constitutional term limit and forced him to resign from power. Similarly, in 2014, the Liberation Technology-aided Citizens Broom social movement in Burkina Faso was able to initiate a nationwide social movement that eventually forced President Blaise Compaoré, who was in power for over a quarter of a century and yet trying to erase the constitutional term limit, to resign and flee out of the country. Again, in 2016, the leaderless and horizontal online movement called Gambia Has Decided was able to amass a large opposition and forced the long-serving and stubborn President Yahya Jammeh out of palace after he refused to accept an electoral defeat. President Jammeh once told the BBC that if God wills, he will rule Gambia for 1 billion years. When the president utters his adamancy, he must consider the willingness of Gambians. Up recently, late in 2017, the This Flag hashtag movement was able to force Zimbabwe's nonagenarian President Mugabe to resign from his nearly 4-decade-old post. This and other similar stories from Sub-Saharan Africa are the very testimonies of the power of new communication tools in reclaiming constitutional rights of citizens and bridging nations with romantic ideals of democracy. The third and final category of social movements in the sub-Saharan part of Africa that's visibly trendy and liberation technology adept is what I prefer to call movements against social disenfranchisement, against discriminatory practice and uneven social labels. Plethora of movements in sub-Saharan Africa are mushrooming. Although the quests are multitude, out of the movements, the goal and purpose of it can be summed up in a single phrase: social inclusion. The advent of new communication tools is the burden of those social pariahs in telling their story and their truths. Liberation technologies made creating a network of like-minded individuals easier and amplify their voices better. In this regard, progressive gender-based social movements are prominent cases across the subcontinent. From the Kenyan My Dress, My Choice woman movement to the Nigerian Being Female in Nigeria social campaigns, women of the subcontinent are amplifying their story and plight in nations which are plagued by entrenched patriarchy. The wide-stretched nappy hair movement across the subcontinent is essentially working in challenging the distorted understanding of beauty in general and hair texture in particular. When South African students were organizing protests on the internet and the streets of South Africa, opposing unconsulted tuition fee hikes in 2015 under the slogan of "Fees must fall," they were reflecting the wider agenda of exclusion in decision making. Generally, in all kinds of these ongoing new social movements, new communication tools are playing an indispensable role. They are serving as powerful vehicles of change for ordinary citizens in the subcontinent. However, the very destination of the vehicle is still blurry to say where it's going. With the interest of understanding the future of the subcontinent's digitized new social movements, examination of some side stories accompanying them is imperative. One of these side stories is the case for new emblematic figures that symbolize the wish and will of these new social movements. The rise of Sankaraism is a very fitting case in that regard. Sankaraism is a yet crawling but rapidly growing in acceptability ideology that made self-reliance and self-respect its basic foundations. Sankaraism, an ideology derived from the ideas and policies of the young and charismatic one-time Burkina Faso president, later assassinated, Thomas Sankara, who ruled Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987. There is one video about Thomas Sankara's view in his life. It's just a 3-minute video, so we can watch it, I think.
Notre pays produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiants, d'assister.
Upper Volta, 1983. Thomas Sankara is brought to power by a coup supported by one of the poorest peoples on our planet. Behind a military uniform with a Marxist discourse, Africa discovers a young and dynamic leader, ready to put his innovative ideas at the service of his fellow citizens. Thomas Sankara gives a new name to his country, Burkina Faso, which means the land of upright men.
Il y en a qui demandent mais où se trouve l'impérialisme. L'impérialisme, regardez dans vos assiettes, quand vous mangez les grains de riz, de maïs, de mil importés, c'est ça l'impérialisme, n'allez pas plus loin.
Little by little, Sankara takes his country out of misery, achieves food self-sufficiency, but clashes with the French who want to keep control over their former colonies. Above all, they want to avoid by all means that Sankara's ideas spread throughout the region.
La France ne comprend pas l'Afrique. Et il est grand temps qu'elle la comprenne. Qui ici ne souhaite pas que la dette soit purement et simplement effacée? Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il peut sortir, prendre son avion et aller tout de suite à la Banque mondiale, payer. Tous nous souhaitons.
Thomas Sankara is attacked by those in the north as well as in the south who benefit from Africa's underdevelopment. His closest collaborator, Blaise Compaoré, with the support of foreign powers, will betray him. Killed for his ideas, Thomas Sankara has become the African Che in the eyes of African youth today.
Pour le grand combat patriotique, pour l'avenir radieux de notre pays, la patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons.
So Thomas Sankara is becoming a figure for many of these social movements in current Sub-Saharan Africa, especially for his self-reliance and his rejection of neo-colonialism, as his fans said. So currently Sankara, as some fondly calls him, the Che Guevara of Africa, is a household name within social movements of every kind in the subcontinent. From the gender-based movements to movements for democracy are recreating and redefining Sankara for the digital age. Graffitis of Sankara are emblazoned on walls from such a one-horse town like Rubua in Sudan to the metropolitan cities like Dakar in Senegal. There are political parties as well in South Africa, in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, in Benin, in many of these Francophone countries who, in their program, inscribe that they are Sankarists. New social movements are resurrecting his ideas, and social media is playing a pivotal role in the mystification of Sankara, the individual. Although there are many flaws, he was accused as a predator of free press in Burkina Faso in his 4 years rule, but his fans and these new social movements ignore that dark side of his story. Rather, they prefer to mystify and mythicize the figure Sankara. Hence, the resuscitation of the forgotten heroes of the subcontinent is the one important takeaway from these new movements. The second side story that can't be ignored and undermined if we are concerned about the future of liberation technology-aided social movements in the subcontinent is the rise of repression technology and technophobic state apparatus. Controlling the traditional public space is not a rigorous task for states. It's an easy task accomplished upon a finger snapping. However, when new communication technologies are digitizing the public sphere itself and the movements are going cyber, even though it's not impossible, but policing is relatively difficult. So, upon a proposal of a new stifling law to the Cameroonian National Assembly, the Assembly's president, Kavai Jibril, called social movement leaders as irresponsible prophets and birds of ill omen. And further, he labeled new communication platforms like social media as a new form of terrorism that's spreading social pandemic. President Ernest Bai Koroma of Sierra Leone accuses social media platforms as weapons that are spreading ill will. Tanzania proposed a new law to curb the impact of new media platforms because they are creating moral decadence. Ethiopia urges the international community to regulate new media platforms because they are spreading poison and threatening peace. But no one better summed the will of many of the subcontinent's states to curb the use of liberation technology as Mofia Chisila, the director of Zambia's Information and Communication Technology Regulatory Authority. Mr. Mofia said, quote, "When you sit in your room on your iPad or your phone and you start commenting, writing, and rubbishing people, you know we will catch up with you. I think we need to switch up, turn the heat. We are now following every lead we have, and we will get to you." End quote. Many countries in the subcontinent are scrambling their resources to outmaneuver liberation technologies with repression technologies on the one hand, and legislating laws criminalizing activities related to social movements on the other hand. These technologies actually, most of them are imported from the West as well, the East, from China, are helping these leaders in the Sub-Saharan Africa to control these technologies used by activists and dissidents alike. Computer crime laws and counterterrorism legislations are employed in many countries. Recently, as well, civil society laws are also used to stifle voices. According to my country-by-country study, since 2015, at least 31 countries in the subcontinent are promulgating or weighing to promulgate new laws to control new media platforms. Thus, heavy-handed efforts by states to silence leaders and parts of new social movements would implicate the gloomy future ahead of us. The third and most important side story of the ongoing social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa is their extended impact on the subcontinent institutions. In contrast with democratic institutions, social movements in general are by design short-lived effort. They are purposed to bridge aspirations with institutions, not to replace institutions. However, as many cases in the subcontinent shows, new social movements are replacing traditional democratic institutions like the mainstream media, political parties, civil society, and in some cases, state apparatus too. The ever-dwindling role of these traditional institutions would cost nations all over the region immensely. According to the 2015 study, How Africa Tweets by the Portland Communication, African tweets are by far the most political in their tone and message compared with other tweets from other continents. Similarly, per recent January 2018 report from the Pew Global, unlike other nations, social media is the #1 source of news for majority of citizens in the sub-Saharan continent. These kinds of trends are testimonies of the dwindling trust of many sub-Saharan Africans to the traditional political and democratic institutions. People are mainly relied to information they get on social medias instead of checking the mainstream media. Actually, it's a global tendency. So these three takeaways are the backtracks of what's going on in Africa. Yeah, there are some hopes, but still this new trends may shackles or may shatter the dreams that many have. So let me conclude this talk with another personal story that would show the hope and caution that many are expressing. One day on June 2014, 2 months after me and 8 of my colleagues got detained by authorities in Ethiopia, one of them is here actually, Ethiopia, as part of the daily routines of interrogation and harassment, I was called and taken to interrogation room. Unlike the usual question that I was asked before, the chief interrogator asked me a strange question on that day, a question about a book titled Revolution 2.0. He asked me why I read it and what lessons that I learned from it. Revolution 2.0 was a book written by Colloquium, an Egyptian internet activist. Since Wael was one of the prominent figures among the leaders of the 2011 Egyptian revolution, the book could be taken as the unofficial chronicle of the revolution. I answered the question as much as possible in a way that wouldn't endanger us all. Finally, the interrogator asked me whether I ever met or talked to Wael or not. I said no. He was furious and threatening. I was adamant and said no again, because I never met or talked to Wael before. 4 years after, last October, I met Wael for the first time here at the Kennedy School. I was happy to see and chat with him. However, I found that the Wael I met and talk in person is very different from the Wael that I know in Revolution 2.0. Wael 2.0 is very cautious of expressing his enthusiasm to the liberation technologies and their capabilities. Witnessing the shattering of dreams of millions of Egyptians in the past 7 years made him this different. Now, everywhere he's going, he never refrained from expressing his ambivalence and his cautions about these technologies. Yes, they are romantic, but we have to be cautious, is his method actually. All right, the future of technology at deep new social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa is on a tightrope. The advent of new networking tools and technologies played a pivotal role in shaping these recent and new kinds of civil mobilizations and engagement. Because they are easily accessible and handy, new communication tools are playing an indispensable role in many of the new social movements that are currently undergoing the continent. Previously, alienated communities and voices got a chance to tell their stories and grievances by circumventing the long-entrenched monopoly of traditional media platforms. However, as much as these new opportunities and efforts are laudable, they are also opening the Pandora's box. Hence, balancing the opportunities with the ever-rising tide of unforeseen troubles is the challenge of the new social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa. As far as the new tools are concerned, their potential is up to those who are utilizing them. When they get deployed with caution, as cyber Ethiopians call them, they are emancipatory. If not, as cyber dystopians warn us, they are harbingers of social discordance. Thank you. So this is an ongoing work. I just summarized my work, and I want your comments or anything about the issues that I raised.
Zelalem, thanks for that paper. You face more obstacles than most of us as scholars, and so I commend your bravery in producing this in the face of what you go through. One of the questions that came to me as you were talking about Zimbabwe is social media and the online world is quite easy to track, to see who's speaking, what they're saying, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, in Zimbabwe, for example, could one make the argument that in fact, social media doesn't have that much to do with it. This is about the military, the generals. That's what's really driving change. I don't know. So I wonder how you can quantify the impact of this online realm compared to, sort of other factors. And thanks for a great paper.
Yeah, the quantification of the data or the information is the most difficult part of the research. As you said, in Zimbabwe especially, yeah, there are people who say that it's the military, unless the military involved or intervene, there may not be a change. But there are as well people who say that the military got the military was intervened because of the heat from activists in the past 2-3 weeks, especially 2-3 weeks before the president's resignation. There was a massive campaign by activists in the diaspora, Zimbabwean diasporas as well, Zimbabweans living in Zimbabwe. So, yeah, quantifying the data and the information is very difficult, but yeah, as I said in the beginning, I want to see the general trends. Yeah, it may, I mean, social media may not have that impact that some activists claim, but at least there is some, there are some pockets of impacts. That's what I believe. But you're right, quantifying the data is a very challenging part of my research.
Thank you so much, Zelalem. That was a wonderful talk. My question is regarding, so we have liberation technology. I was wondering if you've looked at, or if it's a factor, this notion that we've been seeing in the American social media, where you have bots and people trying to interfere, and so something will happen, and then instead of real people kind of talking about the situation, you will have bots going in there and kind of including misleading information that will then affect how people perceive the situation and how they move forward in their daily lives. And I was just wondering if you see these kinds of effects also happening in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Yep, of course. I mean, I think it's a global problem, but in a very different way. If I take Ethiopia as a case, I mean, yeah, there are recently stories, especially in the West, that bots are amplifying this kind of voice against this kind of political candidate and this and that. But if you see the developing world, especially, I mean, as I said, internet penetration is still low, and the diaspora, Africa is a diaspora continent, and there are many diaspora states like Somalia, Eritrea, even Ethiopia. So mainly, I mean, the influence came from these individuals who are living in the West with a political interest. So still, yeah, there are cases of problem. I mean, especially the governments accuse activists who are anonymous, working anonymously for different interests as sinister political activists. But I think we need the voice than silencing them. Yeah, there are bots, I would say, even in the Ethiopian social media sphere, but since there is no other place to talk, the mainstream media is muzzled or controlled, totally controlled by the region. There is only one state broadcaster. There are about 2-3 newspapers with a copy of just 3,000-4,000 per week for 100 million people. So if you consider that, I mean, it's better to ignore the problem from the bots than, yeah, I mean, it's not as pervasive as people are talking here in the West.
Thank you, Zelalem. There is so much more I want to hear from you, and it's resonating with my area of the world that I work on, which is, as you know, the Caribbean. But so the question I have for you has to do with diaspora, and the diasporic connections and the ability to kind of cyberspace transcending these national boundaries. And the instance that I know is in terms of LGBT rights in Jamaica, where most queer Jamaicans simply left because the culture, they either have to go underground or they have to leave because the culture is so repressive. But we're able to organize in the diaspora, and I've forgotten the name of the organization, but I remember that they actually put Kingston as their headquarters. And as much as I tried to search for the actual physical space in Kingston, I couldn't find it. And I do think it was a kind of way of, from the diaspora, using these internet connections to also kind of create connections with people in Jamaica, but as if it's originating from Jamaica. And really, a movement was built in that way. And there were huge changes, in the culture and, so, I mean, I sort of wanted to hear a little bit more about that in terms of these, diasporic connections, because you talked about how so many of the countries people are more, are in the diaspora, and those kinds of connections. And yourself, obviously.
Right, yeah, that's a very important question, especially, from the Sub-Saharan African context. It's very important because, as I said, there are 8 million Americans living abroad, but they don't have this influence. We know that because there are institutions here, because there is, somehow there is a democratic culture. The same is true in Europe. But in most African countries, because of, voices are repressed there in the ground, these diaspora connections and the diasporas or citizens who are living abroad are the only outlets that voices can be vented or people can speak. Many diaspora activists have connections with underground activists back home. So mainly they are working in amplifying stories, in pushing Western governments, donor states, from, for instance, the Ethiopian diaspora. Today there was a congressional hearing about United States aid to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the second most donor country for the United States, and Ethiopians are just pushing members of the Congress that you have to be considerate of what's going on, the human rights violations in your support, in your aid. We know that America have this interest with Ethiopia, the war on terror and these issues, but still we want you to be considerate of what's going on in the ground. So, because of the continent is still dependent on aid as well, because most of the states are repressive, the diaspora's role is very significant, would I say? It's not as, a German diaspora is not as significant as an Ethiopian diaspora in these efforts. So, as you said, the same is true. There are LGBT activists living in the West who are trying to, Ethiopian LGBT activists who are working for queer people in Ethiopia, because it's still a crime there. You can't speak, it's a crime. If you want, if you say you are queer person, there are legal predicaments for that matter, because of it's safe as well, because things are accessible as well. The ground is much more confining. The role of the diaspora is, much significant towards the African states.
In the liberation technology?
Yes, of course. We have to be. Yeah, the technologies are just communication tools. So actually, one of the advantages of this liberation technologies is, anyone can use them. It democratizes the platform. So I can speak for Ethiopia as an Ethiopian who is living in Addis. So it democratizes.
Right.
Zelalem, thank you so much. There were so many interesting things you said on so many accounts, and one of them being the human point of view. As a journalist, I wanted to know if there are mechanisms or laws that could kind of protect you, like Freedom of Information Act? And are these things, are those things that you're fighting for, or do you think that it's no use anyway?
You mean in Ethiopia?
For example, yes.
Yeah, in Ethiopia, yeah, there is the freedom of the mass media and access to information law. I mean, legally there are protections if you see many African countries, but as well there are vicious laws, I mean, that can balance the freedom in the name of peace and security. So there are laws that, I mean, for instance, there is a constitutional right in Ethiopia that I have all the right to express myself in any way possible. But at the same time, there is a criminal law, there is an anti-terrorism law, and there are other laws that I tried to mention, computer crime law recently. Even now, social media regulations are nowadays in many African countries are trying to come up with new laws to regulate social media. So because of, I mean, the right of these vicious laws, even if there are constitutional guarantees, even if there are guarantees by other proclamations and regulations, people are still threatened. I mean, the law is not serving its purpose to protect its citizens.
Hey, I think this was absolutely wonderful. I'm so happy that I got to see this presentation. As an activist from Ferguson, I relate to so many things that you presented today, especially with the liberation technology aspect of this. The way we were contacting Palestinian activists to learn how to make the homemade gas mask, and we saw that there were points of connectivity between what we were experiencing on the ground and what people over there were experiencing. But I do feel that the Black liberation movement in America has not done the greatest job of extending itself to the Black liberation plight in the homeland. And my question is rooted in, with liberation technology and with there being so many common enemies, I'm sure that the terms and conditions in which you were jailed were far more harsher than the conditions in which I was jailed here in America. But still in all, I was jailed for tweeting, jailed for tweets were used in court against me, so forth and beyond. How have you dealt with that, knowing that by proxy of your existence and the things that you're fighting, in some cases you're breaking the law, but you're doing it with righteous intent, but still in all, according to the law of the land, you're breaking the law. And beneath that, my second part of the question is, what are our points of connectivity? So if I'm tweeting things about the movement here in America, what things do you guys need exemplified and uplifted, you know, in a parallel stance, so that we can start to forge some type of unified front? So if there's activists jailed in Africa, how can we support and demand their release via using the technology, the same way that we've done for other cultures, such as the Palestinians? How can we start to extend that to our own direct diaspora?
Yeah, that was a wonderful comment, that well question. Sorry to hear that you were imprisoned. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the universalization of movements and their quests is a very important point. In the 1960s, I mean, I would say that the ideologies like socialism or communism played a unifying role to unify youngsters living in Addis or in Paris or in New York. I mean, there was this enthusiasm about a classless, equal, egalitarian society. But yeah, things have changed since then. Luckily, we have these communication tools. I mean, I can be aware of the U.S. politics real time as living in Addis, as a guy living here in Cambridge. So because of these technologies, we have this comparative advantage with with that generation of the 60s. So as you said, I mean, there are many things that we can learn from each other. When I check my Twitter newsfeed, I mean, most of those people that I'm following are currently Americans, so it looks like, I mean, it's just about what's going on in America in real time. So many of my friends, many of activists back home have the same feeling as well, the same timeline as I. So it makes it easier to learn. For that matter, it's very important to share stories. I mean, after all, it's I mean, in both cases, it's oppression. So that, I mean, we share something at least in that regard beyond our cause. So I think there are many things we can learn from each other, especially the tactics. As you said, you are pursuing the Palestinian activists in dealing with gas mask. One of the accusations against us when we were in prison was taking trainings from Western human rights organizations about how to deal with problems that you face during, in reporting natural disaster or a war. It could be also the authorities take it that, okay, you are planning something big. I mean, if you are training, if you are taking a training from these people to protect yourself, there must be something boiling behind. So, I mean, yeah, there are these connections, whether it's in the West or here. I think there are many things that we can learn.
So if we're thinking about this, the liberation technology and the use of social media as a democratic forum, did you notice any patterns in terms of gender, or age, in terms of who the activists who are most prolific were? And is that way in some ways, is it maybe reproducing social inequalities that might exist or confronting social inequalities? So, for example, you know, in societies that might be repressive towards women, are women you know, active and engaged in social medias in Sub-Saharan Africa? So are there any patterns that you notice along other sort of social categories and even class? So I was thinking about your own positionality. You know, you're very well educated, you're a legal scholar. Does that, so your use of social media might be perceived more as a threat, as a part of like the intellectual elite, than a working class person, you know, perhaps. I don't know. So in terms of thinking about this, is it really democratic, even if it is arguably open to all? It might be used differently, and or not really open to all. And so that's sort of my question, like, who are the users? I have a feeling it's very much biased along age lines. It's a cohort thing, not necessarily a tool that is equally utilized by all activists. So I just wanted you to perhaps address that.
Right, you are. I mean, yeah, of course, Africa is the youngest continent in the world. I mean, about 70% of Africans are young. So, I mean, naturally, yeah, social media and this activism are led by the youngsters because of, I mean, most of Africans are below the age of 25. When we say, I mean, gender-wise, still, yeah, there is this wide discrepancy. I mean, still it's a male-oriented platform, but it's much better than the traditional platforms. I mean, one of the good things about, as I said, of this liberation technology is that they are liberating in a way that they give a chance for anyone who is adept of using them. I mean, there are no traditional barriers to use them. So because of that, I think there is this rise since 2007. For instance, in 2007, number of women in Africa, in the Sub-Saharan Africa, on social media was about 15%, now about 33 something percent. So it's exponentially growing, and potentially I think it's good to take that. It's helping marginalized, oppressed voices in the society. Otherwise, yeah, as you said, class, especially in the biggest gap here in the Sub-Saharan continent is especially on class. I mean, yeah, many poor people can't still afford to use social media. According to a recent data, an average African would spend about 20% of its income on this technology, on using mobile phone or internet, and so it's expensive still, so that it can marginalize poor still. So you are right. Still, it's not still. The playing field is still not even for this class and that class, even gender-wise, as you said. It's a problem. It's one of the research topic actually that I'm trying to address.
Thanks, Zelalem, for the really interesting talk. I thought that the rise of Sankarism was an interesting point, and I was hoping you could talk more about that, and especially how you see these new social movements in relation to a history of revolution, Marxist revolution globally, but also in the case of Ethiopia, Ethiopian new social movements in relation to the history of the Ethiopian revolution.
Yeah, that's a very good point of view here. One of the papers that I'm working, I'm collaborating with a friend is on comparing the 1960s the 1974 Ethiopian revolution with what's happening in the 2010s. So, yeah, there are some similarity, but as I said, the 1974 Ethiopian revolution are all, most of those revolutions happened until the 1980s, are basically, these social movements are basically founded on economic questions or inequality and such issues. Most of them are, socialist oriented for that matter. Currently there is no socialist state in Africa, sadly I would say. There are about 4 states who refers such socialist quests in their constitutions. So I think it's a global problem. Since the fall of Berlin Wall, individuals are disinterested about these quests. Rather, the quests are mainly identitarian, as I said, or cultural in some cases. I see a major shift especially in their aim. In their aim of this revolution, there is a major shift. Previously, there was a global enemy, that's imperialism, as they used to say, but today, it's more internal. Nations are imploding there. There is the transnationality of the quests is becoming, much less and less for many reasons that we can argue actually.
It seems that at one point last year, internet was completely shut down in Ethiopia, if I remember well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what do you do in these circumstances? You put in all these efforts to build these networks and these actions, and then just like in China, internet is just cut, and there was no international condemnation of that. I only knew about it because I have an Ethiopian friend, And I was without news of her for weeks, and then she went to Kenya, and she sent me a message, and she said, you know, internet was shut down. But what do you do in these circumstances?
Yeah, that's a very challenging that you said. I mean, as we speak today, I mean, mobile internet is shut down outside the capital. That means 97 million Ethiopians have no access to internet. Virtually, only 3 to 4 million people who are living in a disk can access. The same is true in Togo today. The same is true in Democratic Republic of Congo, even in Uganda. So last year alone, 11 African countries shut down mobile internet for a brief period of time, especially in elections. If you see Anglophone Cameroon, the government of Cameroon was shutting down internet for about 200 days, I mean, totally. So that's one of the challenges that I talked as a side story. So what can we do? There are some new technologies people are trying to come up with. For instance, there is this technological, I don't know, there is this app called Firehand, and it works via Bluetooth. I mean, when you write a message to a friend, and if someone have that app installed in his or her mobile phone, the individual that you send your message most probably may get the message through using these other phones as a means or an intranet. So, I mean, there are some this kind of trials, but it is still a big challenge. I mean, it's just dark. I mean, when they just cut off the internet, I mean, there is nowhere to talk, there is no way to contact. So it's still a very challenge, but the international community is pushing, especially the United Nations push nations who cut off internet. The African Union recently introduced this new scheme of there is the .afric URL ID. So if nations shut down internet for more than this kind of days, they can access the .africa URL name, and such kinds of measures. I think it's good to at least as a starter, but still, it's a very challenging thing. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Dreaming to work on this kind of topics. Yeah.
Have you enjoyed being at Hutchins? Has it been a good experience?
It's quiet and I like it actually.
Has it been productive? You can work there?
Yes.
That's the most important thing.
Right.
I'm going to send an email to the international office.
Okay.
I'll copy Krishna just to alert them that we're going to do an extension, and then I'll be in touch with a date. Okay?
Yeah.
Then they'll know. It helps us to know. That makes us feel like we're.
Right.
Nice. This is really nice. Thank you so much. I have so many questions. We'll ask you at lunch, okay?
Yeah, we will talk.
Congratulations.
Great, brother. Great.
We'll talk about it, yeah.
Yes, we have to talk.
Yeah, I was checking your Twitter last time.
Yes.
Yeah, you are quite active.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about it.
They've been trying to, even while I've been here, I've had to go back home. They've been trying to press charges against me.
Really?
Yes.
When was that?
In Missouri.
I mean, when?
A couple months ago. Yeah. So my lawyer, every time the state tries to press the charges, they lose the case because they jail me unconstitutionally, but they're still trying to pursue it. So.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, man, definitely.
ምሳ አለኛ ያው የቤታችን የእንትናችን አለው የሴንተሩ አይ ያው ከና ይላል አላት ሄደች አይ አይ በቃ በሰዓቱ ነው ከተኩል በኋላ ይጠይቃል በቃ እሺ ፒሲ መች